Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, dear friends, let your eyes grow heavy and your breath slow down. Tonight, we're going to wander far back together, to a time before alarms and emails, before cities and kings, before anyone ever wrote a single word. Let yourself sink into the softness of your pillow, because we're about to travel through the deepest parts of the human story. Imagine all of human history squeezed into a single day. Just one round of the clock. Everything we have ever built, dreamed, fought for, and loved, all of it packed into 24 hours. That moment when people first learned to plant seeds and stay in one place, that doesn't happen until 11:56 at night. The earliest towns, the first scratchings of writing, the great pyramids rising from the sand, all of that appears at 11:57. A child born in a small town called Bethlehem arrives at 11:58. The machines and smokestacks of the industrial world show up in the very last second. And everything you know, your phone, the internet, rockets leaving Earth, all of it lives inside a tiny fraction of that final tick of the clock. So what fills the other 23 hours and 56 minutes? What is a human story doing while almost an entire day passes by? That long stretch is not a prelude or a waiting room. It is the real story. And we have forgotten nearly all of it. Here is a truth that school books rarely mention. Human beings who look exactly like you, with the same bodies and the same brains, have been walking the earth for at least 300,000 years, maybe longer. For the vast majority of that time, something like 290,000 years, we had no farms, no cities, no rulers, no priests, and no written laws. We lived in small groups, following the changing seasons, reading the land like a familiar language, surviving ice ages, droughts, and predators that could tear us apart in moments. But we were not just clinging to life. We were living, falling in love, raising children, painting and carving, building rich beliefs about the world, forming bonds and communities that lasted for generations. We were completely human, with minds as large and complex as your own, feeling joy, grief, and wonder under the same stars you see tonight. Yet, when people talk about history, they usually mean the story of civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt, Rome and Greece, dynasties and wars and emperors. We act as though everything before farming was just a long, empty waiting period, as if our ancestors spent 100,000 years sitting around, hoping someone would figure out how to bake bread. That is not what happened. Those 100,000 years were bursting with human experience. Tens of thousands of generations lived entire lives. They solved problems we cannot even imagine. They developed skills and knowledge that kept them alive in environments that would leave most of us helpless in days. They made songs and stories that explained the world around them. They laughed. They mourned. They asked the same big questions we still ask today. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens after we die? The trouble is, they did not write anything down. There are no history books from 50,000 years ago. No diaries, no letters, no records of taxes or trade. Everything we know about them comes in fragments. A few stone tools, a cave painting, a scattering of bones, a handful of ancient campfires where we can see the pattern of a meal from 40,000 years ago and try to imagine what they talked about as they ate. It is like trying to understand your entire family history from 3 old photographs and a dusty box of your great-great-grandfather's tools. You can learn something, but you will never get the whole story. If you are listening to this to help yourself fall asleep, that is perfect. That is exactly why these stories exist. And if you feel like it, you might leave a quiet comment telling where you are watching from and what time the clock shows where you are. There is something lovely about seeing those places appear. Tokyo at sunrise, Miami at midnight. It is strange and beautiful that we are all here together, spread across different time zones, thinking about the enormous depth of time, because that is what we are doing tonight. We are traveling back through the deep past the pyramids, past the first farmers, past the last great ice age, all the way to the time when humans were becoming truly human, not in our bodies. Those had been modern for a long while, but in our minds, that moment somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, when something clicked inside the human brain, when we became capable of things no other creature had ever done. We are going to walk alongside our ancestors through landscapes that no longer exist. We will see them hunting woolly mammoths on frozen grasslands, gathering shellfish on coastlines that are now hundreds of feet beneath the sea. We will creep into dark caves where they painted masterpieces by flickering firelight 40,000 years ago. We will try to understand their spiritual lives, their technologies, their friendships, the very way they saw reality. And here is what makes this journey so strange and so beautiful. Those people, your own ancestors 2,000 generations back, had the same capacity for thought that you have, the same emotions. If you could somehow reach back in time and bring a newborn baby from 50,000 years ago into our world, that child would grow up completely normal. They could learn calculus, play the violin, become a software engineer. The only difference between them and us is time and the slow buildup of knowledge. They did not know less because they were less intelligent. They knew less because they came earlier. And in some ways, they knew far more than we do about survival, about reading the natural world, about living in balance with a land that could kill you if you made a single wrong move. So let us go back before civilization, back before history as we usually think of it, back to those hidden 100,000 years when humans were fully human, but living in a world we can barely recognize, back to where our real story begins. Something shifted inside the human mind sometime between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Not in our bodies. Those have been changing slowly for millions of years. Not in the size of our brains. That had already reached modern proportions. No, this was something invisible, something that would turn one clever species of ape into the most powerful force on the planet. Researchers call it the cognitive revolution. But that name makes it sound like a single event, a sudden moment when a switch flipped inside someone's head and everything changed. The truth was messier, stranger, and far more interesting. Picture your ancestors around 90,000 years ago. Looking at them, you would see someone almost exactly like you. Same shape of skull, same body, same brain tucked inside. If you dress one in modern clothes and put them on a subway, you would probably not notice anything unusual. But if you try to have a real conversation with them, you would quickly realize something was deeply different. The question that haunts archaeologists is simple and unsettling. What was going on inside those modern-looking skulls before the revolution? They had the hardware, the physical equipment for complex thought. But did they have the software? Were they conscious in the same way you are? Could they imagine futures that did not yet exist? Could they create meanings that had nothing to do with immediate survival? We do not know. We cannot know. Consciousness does not leave fossils. But we have clues. And those clues suggest that sometime during that window, something unprecedented emerged inside the human mind. The earliest hints appear around 100,000 years ago in a cave called Blombos on the southern coast of South Africa. Archaeologists found pieces of ochre, a reddish mineral that humans had used for hundreds of thousands of years, probably for practical things like treating animal hides or protecting skin from the sun. But these pieces were different. Someone had carved geometric patterns into them, crisscrossing lines, carefully made, forming abstract designs that serve no practical purpose at all. Think about what that means. Someone looked at a lump of red rock and decided it was not enough for it to just be a rock. They needed it to mean something, to represent something, to be beautiful or important or marked in a way that mattered only inside a human mind. That is symbolic thinking. The ability to create and handle meanings that exist purely in the world of thought. And it is the foundation of everything that makes humans unusual. Language, art, mathematics, religion, law, money, entire nations. All of it depends on our ability to build shared stories that everyone agrees are real, but one cave does not make a revolution. Blombos could have been a fluke, a single genius experimenting with ideas that did not spread. What makes the cognitive revolution truly revolutionary is that this kind of behavior starts showing up everywhere, across Africa and eventually beyond. Shell beads from sites in Morocco and Algeria, dated to 82,000 years ago. Not just any shells, but shells that were carefully chosen, pierced, and worn as decorations. Someone cared about how they looked. Someone wanted to show symbols of identity or status or belonging. Sophisticated bone tools that go beyond simple usefulness to show care in design and aesthetic choice. Evidence of long-distance trade networks. with materials moving hundreds of miles from where they came from, suggesting not just exchange but real social relationships, trust, shared obligations stretching across space and time. And everywhere, more ochre than any practical need could explain. Our ancestors were drawn to it, mining it, grinding it, using it in ways we still do not fully understand. Probably for painting their bodies, possibly for rituals, definitely for something that mattered deeply to them in ways that went far beyond staying alive. So what happened? What flipped the switch inside human minds? One idea points to language. Not the simple calls and signals that earlier humans probably had, warnings and basic coordination, but full grammatical language, capable of expressing abstract ideas, hypothetical situations, past events, and future possibilities. Language changes everything. With language, you do not just survive the world. You explain it. You create stories about why things happen, where you came from, what comes after death. You can teach complex skills without showing them directly. You can pass knowledge across generations without meeting face to face. You can lie, imagine, wonder about alternatives to reality. Most importantly, you can cooperate in ways no other species can. You can build shared beliefs about ancestors, gods, or group identities that bring thousands of strangers together into working communities. You can convince people to follow rules, make sacrifices, work toward goals that none of them would benefit from alone. But language does not appear in the fossil record. Voices do not preserve. So we are left guessing, inferring its development from the effects it would have produced. Another idea looks to genetics. Perhaps there was a mutation, a small change in the way the brain was wired that opened up new abilities. There is some interesting evidence of this. A gene called FOXP2, which is crucial for language, shows signs of recent change in modern humans. Shifts in brain development genes might have altered how neural networks formed, creating new possibilities for abstract reasoning. But genetic changes usually happen slowly, over many generations across whole populations. They do not flip like a light switch. And the archaeological evidence suggests the cognitive revolution happened relatively quickly, within a few tens of thousands of years. That is fast for evolution. So maybe it was not a single cause. Maybe it was a cascade. A small genetic change leads to slightly better language. That allows slightly more complex social life. That creates pressure to develop even better communication. That enables richer culture, which changes the environment for natural selection all over again, back and forth. Genes and culture pulling each other forward in a speeding loop. And somewhere in that process, humans cross a threshold. We became capable of imagination. Imagination is the real superpower. It is what lets you think about things that are not real yet, might never be real, exist only as possibilities in your mind. A lion cannot imagine new hunting strategies it has never tried. A chimpanzee cannot picture tools it has never seen. But humans can. We can close our eyes and run through imaginary worlds, test ideas in our heads before trying them in the real world. With imagination comes storytelling. And storytelling might be the most powerful tool humans ever invented, more important than fire or stone tools or farming. Stories let you pass along complex information smoothly. Instead of explaining every detail of how to track prey through tall grass, you tell a story about a hunter who succeeded or failed. The emotions make it memorable. The shape of the story makes it understandable. The shared experience of telling brings a group closer together and strengthens what everyone knows. Stories also let you create social tools. Laws are stories about right and wrong. Religions are stories about the meaning of everything. National identities are stories about shared past and common destiny. Money is a story we all agree believe about value. None of these things exist in the physical world. They are pure imagination, but they shape our lives as powerfully as gravity. And our ancestors, those fully modern humans living between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, were figuring all of this out, probably not consciously, not understanding what they were creating. But generation by generation, their mental toolkit was growing. Their ability to think symbolically and communicate abstractly was improving. Their capacity to work together through shared stories was expanding. They were becoming human, not in body, that had already happened, but in mind, in awareness, in that strange ability to live at the same time in the real world and in the imagined worlds of meaning and symbol and story. And they were not alone. Neanderthals were doing something similar in Europe. Evidence suggests they made art, buried their dead with care, and probably had language. The Denisovans, about whom we know much less, were likely just as advanced in their own way. The ability for symbolic thought might have been emerging across several human species, all carrying the potential for imagination. But only one species would take it to its farthest conclusion. Only Homo sapiens would become so deeply dependent on shared fictions that we would eventually reshape the entire planet according to ideas that existed nowhere except in our collective minds. That story, though, was still just beginning. For now, your cognitively modern ancestors were still one of several human groups living across Africa, testing their new mental abilities, learning to think in ways that would seem like magic to any other animal on Earth. The question was not whether they could imagine new worlds. The question was what they would do with that power. Then came the moment that would define our species forever. Around 60,000 years ago, a small band of humans stood on the shores of northeastern Africa, looking across a narrow stretch of water toward the Arabian Peninsula. They were not the first to try this journey. Earlier groups had left Africa before, spreading into the Middle East and beyond. But most of those populations had died out or been absorbed. This time would be different. These were not random wanderers. These were people carrying all the genetic and cultural tools refined over hundreds of thousands of years. They had rich language, complex social bonds, advanced ways of making tools, and most importantly, a deep adaptability born from ancestors who had survived the impossible. When they crossed that narrow sea, perhaps only 15 miles at its narrowest point, they began the greatest journey in human history. No one knows exactly why they left. Maybe population pressure had grown too intense in Africa. Maybe a particularly good season made the far side look promising. Maybe they were just curious, pushed by that deeply human urge to see what lay beyond the horizon. Whatever the reason, they went, and they kept going. The evidence in our genes tells us this was not one massive migration. It was more like a slow leak that never stopped. Small groups splitting off, moving into new territories, settling in, then sending out their own small groups, generation after generation. Each move was not huge, perhaps only 20 or 30 miles, the distance a family could walk in a few days. But those small moves added up. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread from Africa all the way to Australia. Think about that. In less than 5,000 years, small bands of people walking with everything they own had covered a quarter of the planet. The paths they took are still debated. The traditional idea suggested they followed the coastlines, hugging the shores of the Arabian Peninsula, then moving along the Indian coast towards Southeast Asia. This makes sense. Coastal environments are rich in food. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, all fairly easy to gather with simple tools. Follow the coast, and you always know where to find water. You cannot get lost. The ocean becomes your map. Recent discoveries support this coastal route. Sites along the southern Arabian coast show human occupation, dating back 55,000 years or more. Shell middens, the ancient trash piles of seafood meals, appear along migration routes from Africa to Australia. Stone tools found at these sites show clear African roots, the technological fingerprint of people who learned their craft on another continent. But the coast was not the only path. Other groups moved inland, following rivers and game trails across the Arabian interior. During certain periods when the climate was wetter, what is now harsh desert would have been grassland dotted with lakes and rivers. Archaeological sites in the Arabian interior show human presence during these green windows, evidence of people using temporary chances to push into lands that would later become unlivable. Both routes brought challenges that would have killed less flexible species. The coast meant learning completely new foods. These Africans had never seen a mangrove forest, never harvested oysters, never built boats that could cross even small stretches of open water. They had to figure out as they went, teaching their children skills they had invented themselves just years before. The inland route was even harder. Water sources could be hundreds of miles apart. The plants and animals were unfamiliar, potentially dangerous. One wrong turn, one bad guess about where the next water might be, and whole groups could die of thirst. The The fact that any group succeeded tells us something deep about their ability to plan and their knowledge of the land. And they were not just surviving, they were thriving enough to keep growing. Patterns of genetic diversity show that these migrating populations were not desperate refugees fleeing disaster. They were healthy, reproducing groups, capable of splitting off new bands every few generations. Each split sent pioneers into unknown territory, while the parent group stayed behind, holding on to their familiar grounds and resources. By 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Southeast Asia. We know this because of sites like Tam Pa Ling Cave in Laos, where human remains dating to at least 46,000 years ago show African ancestry. These people had traveled thousands of miles from their original homeland, crossed many climate zones, learned to use dozens of new food sources, and still kept enough of their original culture that we can recognize them as descendants of African populations. But the most astonishing journey was still to come. Somewhere in Southeast Asia, a group of humans looked out across the ocean toward a land they might have glimpsed on very clear days. Australia. Getting there would require a level of seafaring skill that seems almost impossible for people with stone tools. Even when sea levels were at their lowest during the ice ages, the distance from Indonesia to Australia was never less than 50 miles of open water. There is no way to walk it, no islands to hop across. You must build boats capable of carrying people, supplies, and enough drinking water to survive days at sea. You must navigate out of sight of land. You must be absolutely certain you will reach the other side, because there is no turning back once you are committed. Yet they did it. Archaeological evidence now shows humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The Majbeeb shelter in northern Australia contains artifacts dating back 65,000 years, including finely made stone tools, ground oak for art, and signs of systematic hunting of large marsupials. This means humans crossed Australia almost immediately after leaving Africa. Within only 5,000 years, they had mastered sea travel advanced enough for major ocean voyages. Think about what this required. They needed to understand boat building, probably using bamboo or wooden frames covered with bark or animal hides. They needed navigation skills, the ability to read stars, ocean currents, and weather patterns. They needed planning abilities sophisticated enough to prepare for a voyage that might take weeks. And they needed courage, the willingness to sail toward a horizon where they could not be certain anything existed at all. The people who made that first crossing must have been remarkable, but they were not superhuman. They were ordinary people using the same basic mental tools all humans share. The fact that they succeeded tells us something important about human potential. Give people a challenge, and they will develop the skills to overcome it. If the technology does not exist, they will invent it. If the knowledge is missing, they will figure it out through trial and error. That is what it means to be human. Once they reach Australia, these pioneers face another great test. Australia's giant animals, enormous kangaroos, massive wombats, predatory birds large enough to kill a human, were unlike anything in Africa or Asia. The plants were different. The seasons followed unfamiliar patterns. The whole ecology was alien. Within a few thousand years, they had not only adapted but spread across the entire continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from coastal regions to the harsh deserts of the interior. Meanwhile, back in Asia, other groups were pushing north and west. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached Europe, entering a landscape already occupied by Neanderthals who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. That meeting would have enormous consequences, but that is another part of the story. The remarkable thing about this whole expansion is how consistent the pattern was. Small groups moving into new territory, adapting to local conditions, growing till they reached the limits of what the land could support, then splitting again to send pioneers even farther. The same pattern that carried humans from the Red Sea to the Pacific in just a few thousand years. The same pattern that would eventually bring humans to nearly every habitable place on Earth. Studies of modern DNA let us trace these ancient journeys with surprising detail. Indigenous Australians carry genetic markers that split off from African populations around 60,000 years ago, matching the archaeological timeline perfectly. Native Americans carry markers showing their ancestors separated from East Asian populations around 25,000 years ago, then crossed into the Americas during the last ice age. Pacific Islanders show the genetic signatures of multiple waves of migration, each pushing farther into the unknown ocean. Every one of these journeys required the same basic human abilities: the ability to learn and adapt quickly, the ability to cooperate in groups large enough to survive, but small enough to move easily, the creativity to invent new technologies when old ones were not enough, and the courage to keep moving into unknown lands when staying in familiar places would have been safer. The people who made these journeys were not thinking about conquering continents or making history. They were just living their lives, moving to new hunting grounds when old ones grew crowded, following animal migrations, exploring that interesting valley they could see in the distance. But those small decisions, repeated across thousands of generations, resulted in the most complete biological takeover the planet has ever seen. Within 50,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had reached nearly every livable environment on Earth. We had adapted to tropical rainforests and frozen tundra, to high mountains and low coastlines, to deserts and wetlands and everything in between. No other large mammal has ever done anything close to this. And we did it with stone tools, fire, and the most powerful tool evolution has ever created: the human mind, capable of solving any problem, overcoming any obstacle, adapting to any place. The journey was only just beginning. Now let us talk about what they actually did with their days. Your ancestors, the ones living 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 years ago. Because here is something that most people get completely wrong. When we imagine prehistoric humans, we often see desperate, dirty creatures, always hungry, always struggling, living in caves, eating raw meat, dying young. That image has been burned into our minds by popular stories. But the evidence from the ground tells a very different story. These people were not primitives barely holding on. They were skilled hunter-gatherers with rich, complicated daily lives. And in some ways, they may have lived better than the farming societies that would come later. Let us start with the caves, because that is the first myth we need to set aside. Yes, they sometimes use caves, but mostly as temporary shelters, seasonal camps, or special places for rituals. Most of the time, your ancestors lived out in the open. They built real structures from wood, bone, and animal hides. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of large, shared dwellings that could hold 20 or 30 people. Not crude huts either. These were carefully planned buildings with indoor hearths, separate sleeping areas, even different zones for different activities. One site in what is now the Czech Republic shows a dwelling built from mammoth bones and hides. The bones were arranged in careful patterns to create a domed structure, with heavy tusks used as anchor points. Inside, researchers found the remains of several hearths placed to spread heat evenly. There were storage pits dug into the floor, work areas where stone tools were made, even what looks like a designated trash area some distance from the main building. These people understood cleanliness, heat flow, and how to organize space. They were architects. In Africa, evidence is harder to find because wood and plant materials rot quickly in warm, wet climates. But what we do find suggests even more sophistication. Sites show rings of stones that probably held down the edges of temporary structures made from branches and leaves. But these are not random campsites. They are carefully chosen locations near water, with good views for spotting both game animals and possible dangers. They are placed to catch breezes in hot weather and to find shelter from wind in cold seasons. Your ancestors were reading the landscape the way we read a book, choosing the best spot for every camp based on many different environmental clues. And they moved often, not because they were desperate wanderers fleeing starvation, but because they were following a well-planned seasonal calendar. Modern studies of remaining hunter-gatherer societies show this pattern clearly, and archaeological evidence suggests it goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Spring in one valley where certain plants become available. Summer near a river where fish are spawning. Fall in the highlands where nut trees drop their harvest. Winter back to a base camp where stored food and shelter materials are waiting. This was not random wandering. This was an annual cycle as precise as any farmer's planting schedule, except it required even more detailed knowledge of the natural world. Think about what that means. Your ancestors knew hundreds, perhaps thousands of plant species, which ones were good to eat, which were poisonous, which could be made safe through cooking or soaking. They knew when each plant flowered, fruited, and dropped its seeds. They knew which roots could be dug in spring, which berries ripened in summer, which nuts fell in autumn. They could read animal tracks and droppings to identify the species, age, sex, and health of an animal. They understood the migration patterns of herds across whole regions. They knew where to find water in every season, how to predict coming weather from the wind and clouds, which caves held good flint for tools, and which had the right kind of clay for making pots. This was a different kind of intelligence than what we value today, but it was just as advanced, probably more so in many ways. A modern person dropped into their world would die quickly. One of them dropped into ours would probably figure things out eventually. The learning curve might be steep, but the basic mental tools were already there. And here is what really challenges our assumptions. They did not work very hard. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers consistently find the same pattern. About 15 to 20 hours each week spent on what we would call getting food and making tools. That is all. Compare that to farming societies, where people work from sunrise to sunset every day during planting and harvest seasons. Compare it to modern industrial life, where 40-hour weeks are considered normal and many people work much more. Your ancestors had time, plenty of it. What did they do with all those hours? They socialized. They played games. They told stories. They made art. They explored their surroundings not because they had to, but because they were curious. They tried new ways of making tools, preparing food, decorating their bodies. They had leisure, real leisure, in a way that would not exist again for most of humanity until very recently. A typical day in camp might have looked something like this. Dawn breaks and the camp slowly wakes. No alarms, no strict schedules. People rise when they are ready. A fire is rekindled from embers that were kept alive from a night before, a trick that saves the work of starting a new fire every day. Someone begins preparing a morning meal, probably using leftovers from the evening plus whatever fresh plants can be gathered quickly nearby. Children play under the loose watch of whoever is around. There is no formal childcare because everyone is watching everyone. The whole camp is a shared space. Young children play games that will teach them skills they will need later. Tracking games where they follow marks in the dirt. Throwing games that build coordination. They are learning all the time, but it does not look like education. It looks like fun. Meanwhile, a few adults head out to check traps set the day before. Others might go to a nearby grove of nut trees to see if any have fallen overnight. This is not hard work. It is a morning walk that happens to provide food. They are usually back by mid-morning with whatever they found, probably chatting and laughing the whole way. The middle of the day is when more serious work happens, but even that is social. A group decides to go hunting, not because the camp is starving, but because fresh meat sounds good and the weather is right and someone saw animal tracks yesterday. They prepare their weapons, talk over their plan, and head out as a coordinated team. Or maybe today is a plant gathering day instead. A different group walks to a place several miles away where certain roots are ready to harvest. They bring digging sticks and carrying bags, working together to pull the tough roots from the ground, sharing the work and the conversation. Back at camp, someone is making new tools, not frantically, not under pressure, but with the careful attention of a craftsperson who has time to do things right. Others might be tanning hides, making rope from plant fibers, or repairing the shelters. These are all necessary tasks, but they are done in a relaxed, shared atmosphere. People work side by side, share techniques, help each other with difficult parts of the job. Then there's the evidence that really changes how we think about these people, the care they showed for the disabled and the elderly. We find skeletons from this period showing people who survived for years or even decades with serious injuries or disabilities. A Neanderthal skeleton from Iraq shows a man who had lost an arm long before he died. He could not have hunted effectively or done heavy labor, but he lived to an old age. Someone was caring for him, feeding him, protecting him, not out of genetic duty, but out of something we might call compassion. Another skeleton from Spain shows evidence of a severe spinal deformity that would have left the person nearly unable to move from childhood. yet they lived into their teens. For years, someone carried them when the group moved. Someone fed them. Someone made sure they were not left behind. There was no practical benefit to this. It was pure care, and older individuals show up regularly in the archaeological record. People who lived long past their childbearing years. In purely evolutionary terms, these people were using up resources without adding to the gene pool. But every hunter-gatherer society we know values elders as living libraries of knowledge. They are the ones who remember what to do when rare events happen. The flood that comes once every 30 years. The animal migration that shifts in unexpected ways. The plant that is usually poisonous but becomes safe after special preparation. Your ancestors understood something that modern society sometimes forgets. A community is stronger when it includes everyone. The person with a disability might not hunt, but they can make tools, tend fires, watch children. The elderly might not gather food, but they could teach, advise, settle arguments. Everyone had value. Everyone belonged. Evenings were when the real magic happened. The group gathered around the fires as darkness fell. This was when stories were told, not just for fun, though they were certainly fun. These stories were how knowledge traveled between generations, how to find water in the dry season, what plants heal which sicknesses, where the herds go in different years. All of it woven in details that were easy to remember, easy to repeat, easy to pass down through time. This was also when music happened. Bone flutes from 40,000 years ago show a sophisticated understanding of musical scales. But the tradition is surely much older. Your ancestors were singing, drumming, making rhythms with whatever they had at hand. Why? Because humans make music. It is what we do when we have time and we are together and we are feeling good about the world. And they were laughing. We know this not from direct evidence, of course, but from the fact that every human culture that exists today laughs, jokes, teases, plays. There is no reason to think your ancestors 100,000 years ago were any different. The camp at night was not just about survival. It was about joy. As the fire burned down, people drifted towards sleep. No alarms waiting in the morning. No schedules to keep. Just a rhythm of days following nights. Seasons following seasons. Years flowing into years. They measured time by natural cycles. The moon growing and shrinking. The stars moving through their yearly patterns. The migrations of animals and the flowering of plants. It was a good life. Hard sometimes. Certainly dangerous. But also rich, complex, deeply satisfying in ways that later farming societies would lose. These people had freedom, free time, strong social bonds, and deep knowledge of their surroundings. They had art, music, stories, and play. They had everything that makes us human, everything that truly matters. And out of this life of relative ease and creativity, everything else would eventually grow. The new ideas that would lead to civilization. The social structures that would become kingdoms. The stories that would become religions. The art that would cover cave walls and eventually museum walls. But that was still far in the future. For now, your ancestors were simply living. And living well. Imagine walking into a cave in southern France. It is 1994, and you are part of a team squeezing through a narrow passage that has been sealed for thousands of years. You pull yourself through a tight opening, and your flashlight beam hits the wall. And there, staring back at you, are lions. Dozens of them, perfectly drawn, muscular, alive, not rough stick figures, not simple scratches. These are masterpieces. Horses gallop across the limestone. Rhinos charge. Bears lumber with a weight you can almost feel. And they are 36,000 years old. This is Chalvet Cave. And it changed everything we thought we knew about early human art. For decades, archaeologists had a comfortable story. Human artistic ability developed slowly, starting with crude scratches and getting better over thousands of years. The famous bulls of Lascaux, painted around 17,000 years ago, was supposed to be the peak of prehistoric art, the result of a long, slow build-up. Then Chalvet was discovered, and that story fell apart. Because the paintings in Chalvet are not just older than Lascaux. They are better, more sophisticated, more dynamic, more skilled in almost every way. The artists who painted those caves 36,000 years ago understood perspective, shading, movement, and the shapes of animals at a level that would not be seen again for tens of thousands of years. But here is what keeps archaeologists awake at night. Childhood is not the beginning of this artistic tradition. It cannot be. No one wakes up one morning and suddenly paints a masterpiece without practice, without training, without a long tradition of learning and trying. Which means human artistic ability must go back even further, possibly much further. We just have not found the earlier examples yet. Maybe they were painted on rock shelters that have worn away. Maybe they were drawn on wood or animal skin that rotted long ago. Maybe they are still waiting in caves we have not discovered. But somewhere, sometime, humans made the leap from simple communication to true art, and we still do not fully understand why. The traditional explanation was that something changed in the human brain around 40 to 50,000 years ago. A genetic change, maybe a rewiring of connections, something that gave us symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, the ability to imagine things that do not exist and then bring them into being through art. But the more evidence we gather, the less satisfying this explanation becomes. Because art shows up across the world in populations that have been separated for thousands of years. In Indonesia, cave paintings date back at least 45,000 years. In Australia, Aboriginal rock art might be even older, though dating it precisely is difficult. Hand stencils appear in caves from Europe to Argentina to Asia, all using remarkably similar techniques, created by people who had never met, who had no way of sharing ideas across oceans and continents. This suggests that art is not something that happened once and then spread. It is something fundamental to being human, something that emerged naturally, again and again, wherever people had enough time, resources, and safety to express themselves. But what were they expressing? Why spend hours, days, maybe weeks painting animals on cave walls when you could be hunting, gathering, making tools, doing something practical that directly helps you survive? Walk into any of these painted caves, and you immediately feel that something important was happening there. These were not casual doodles. Many of the images are placed in the deepest, hardest to reach parts of the caves, places where you would need torches, ropes, maybe even scaffolding to reach, places where no natural light ever enters. The artist had to carry fire into absolute darkness, mixing paints from minerals, charcoal, and animal fat, applying them with brushes, fingers, or perhaps blowing them through hollow bones. This took effort, deliberate, sustained, difficult effort. They were doing this on purpose. They were trying to accomplish something specific. But what? The oldest explanation is hunting magic. Paint the animal. Control the animal. Make sure the hunt goes well by capturing your prey symbolically on the wall. It is a satisfying idea. Except most of the animals painted in these caves were not actually hunted very often. Analysis of bone from nearby living sites shows that people mostly ate reindeer, but they painted mostly horses, bison, or dangerous predators like cave lions, animals they admired, perhaps, but not animals they depended on for food. Then there's a lion man, found in a cave in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory around 40,000 years ago. It is about a foot tall, and it is utterly impossible. A human body with a lion's head, something that never existed, never could exist, except in someone's imagination. Whoever carved this spent hundreds of hours working ivory with stone tools, making something that served no practical purpose at all. No one was going to eat it, wear it, or use it to hunt, or build, or survive. It was pure imagination made real. It was art for the sake of art. Or maybe it was religion. The lion man might represent a spirit, a god, a shaman transformed, something beyond the everyday world. It proves that by 40,000 years ago, humans were not just surviving anymore. They were thinking about meaning, about identity, about the relationship between humans and animals, between the real and the imagined, between the visible and the invisible. The hand stencils are even more direct. Found in caves across every inhabited continent, the technique is always the same. Place your hand on the wall, blow paint around it, leave a negative image, a permanent record. I was here. I existed. Remember me. Some of these hands are small, probably from children. Some show missing fingers, perhaps from frostbite or accidents. One cave in Spain shows hands spanning at least 25,000 years, generation after generation returning to the same spot to add their mark. It is one of the most human things imaginable, the desire to leave something behind, to say to the future, I lived, I mattered, please do not forget me. And then there are the Venus figurines, small carved statues, mostly of women, found across Europe and Asia, dating from about 35,000 to 10,000 years ago. Some show exaggerated breasts and hips, leading to theories about fertility symbols or mother goddess worship. Others are more realistic. Some show elaborate hairstyles or clothing. A few show faces, though most do not. What were they? Religious objects? Portable art? Dolls? Self-portraits? No one knows. But they were important enough that people carried them across huge distances. Important enough to carve carefully from stone, ivory, or clay. Important enough to keep and protect over thousands of years. The debates about the Venus figurines show how little we actually know about the minds of prehistoric people. Modern interpretations tend to project our own assumptions backward. Early researchers called them primitive pornography. Later scholars saw evidence of ancient matriarchies. Others see fertility magic, body acceptance, ancestor worship, teaching tools. The truth is, we are looking at objects made by people whose view of the world was so different from ours that we can barely guess at their meanings. But one thing seems clear. These were not just practical objects. They were meaningful. They mattered to their creators in ways that went far beyond simple survival. Music might be even older than visual art. Bone flutes discovered in Germany date back more than 40,000 years, carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory with carefully spaced finger holes. These are not random objects. They are carefully made instruments designed to produce specific notes, specific sounds. Someone sat down and figured out the mathematics of sound, experimented with where to put the holes, tested different materials. And they did this not because music helped them hunt or gather or survive, but because humans need music, need rhythm, melody, the shared experience of sound. The cave paintings may have been accompanied by singing, chanting, drumming. Researchers have identified parts of caves with unusual acoustics, places where sound echoes and shifts in strange, powerful ways. Were these the first concert halls? Places where people gathered not just to see art, but to experience it, to take part in ceremonies that combine sight, sound, and probably movement into overwhelming sensory experiences. Think about what this means. 40,000 years ago, your ancestors were not just struggling to survive. They were creating, painting, sculpting, carving, playing music, dancing, probably telling elaborate stories we will never hear. They were building cultures as rich and complex as any that would come later. They just did not have writing to save them, cities to make them permanent, or farming to support them. But the drive was there. The need to create, to express, to leave something beautiful behind. It was already fully human, fully developed, fully sophisticated. We did not become creative. We have always been creative. Art is not something civilization gave us. It is something we brought with us into civilization, something older and deeper than farming, older than cities, older than everything except language itself. And here is something fascinating that researchers are beginning to discover. Much of this art might have been made by women, by children, by people who have traditionally been invisible in stories about the past. Hand stencils show that at least half, maybe more, belong to women and teenagers. The detailed, patient work of painting and carving fits the patterns of women's work in many hunter-gatherer societies. The Venus figurines of their self-portraits suggest women making images of themselves, defining their own identities instead of being defined by male observers. We have spent centuries assuming prehistoric art was made by men. Now the evidence suggests otherwise. The first artists might have been mothers painting while their children played nearby, grandmothers passing down techniques through generations, young people experimenting with style and meaning. The explosion of art that happened around 40,000 years ago was not a sudden mutation or a miraculous invention. It was a flowering of something that had been building for tens of thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands, something fundamental to what it means to be human, the need to transform the world, to make it meaningful, to leave marks that will last longer than our short lives. Your ancestors did this deep in dark caves by flickering torchlight. They made beauty for its own sake. They sang songs that have been silent for 40,000 years. They told stories we will never recover, but the drive that moved them lives on in you. Every time you draw, sing, dance, or make anything at all, you are taking part in a tradition that stretches back into the deepest darkness of prehistory. You are doing what humans have always done, making meaning out of existence, turning survival into something worth surviving for. And this was only the beginning. Now we need to talk about something that does not turn into fossils, something that leaves only the faintest traces in ground, but something that might be the most important adaptation humans ever developed. Belief. Not belief in the modern sense, with churches and priests and holy books. That came much later. We are talking about something more basic, more ancient, the moment when humans started to think that death was not the end, that there was something beyond the visible world, that the spirits of ancestors still had an effect on the living. The evidence is scattered and incomplete, but it is there if you know where to look. The oldest deliberate burial we've found dates back over 100,000 years. A cave in Israel, Kafsa Cave, where early modern humans laid their dead to rest with intention and care, not just throwing bodies into a pile or leaving them where they fell, but digging graves, placing bodies carefully, sometimes putting objects beside them. Why would you do that unless you believe the dead person still existed somehow, still needed things, still mattered? Here is where it gets really interesting. The Neanderthals were doing it too, perhaps even earlier. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq has given us some of the most haunting evidence of Neanderthal burial practices. Between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, Neanderthals were using this cave as a shelter, a home, probably for generation after generation. And when members of their group died, they buried them there carefully, deliberately, in positions that show thought and meaning. One burial in particular has captured imaginations for decades. Archaeologists call it Shanidar 4. When researchers dug up this grave in the 1960s, they found something unexpected. Pollen, a lot of it, concentrated around and under the skeleton in patterns, suggesting that flowers had been placed in the grave. Not just any flowers, medicinal plants. Yarrow cornflower, hollyhock, plants that had healing properties. That meant something to the people who picked them. The image is almost unbearably moving. Neanderthals gathering wildflowers to put with their dead, standing at the edge of a grave, perhaps saying words we will never know, certainly feeling something we would recognize as grief. Now, there is debate about this. Some researchers think the pollen got there through natural processes, burrowing animals or wind, but the way it is concentrated is hard to explain away that easily. And even if Shanidar 4 is controversial, there are other Neanderthal burials that clearly show intentional treatment of the dead. Graves with stone tools placed beside the body. Burials where the deceased was positioned in a curled, sleeping pose. One remarkable site in France where a Neanderthal child was buried with what looks like a carefully shaped stone tool placed near their hand. These were not just ways of getting rid of a body. These were rituals, acts of meaning in the face of death. What does this tell us about Neanderthal minds? About their inner worlds? It tells us they had crossed a line that most animals never approach. They had developed an awareness of death as a permanent state, not just the absence of movement, but something final and significant. And having understood that finality, they had an immediate response to mark it, to perform rituals around it, perhaps even to deny it by imagining an afterlife. This is huge. This is the beginning of religion, of spirituality, of every philosophical and religious system humans would ever create. But burial is just the most visible evidence. There are other clues, harder to interpret, but equally suggestive. Cave art, for instance. When you stand in front of a 30,000-year-old painting on a cave wall, you are not just looking at a pretty picture. You are looking into someone's mind, and that mind was doing something very strange. Many of the most famous cave paintings are in extremely difficult places to reach, deep underground, through narrow passages, in chambers where you need to crawl or squeeze to enter. Why go to all that trouble? Why not paint near the entrance where everyone could see? Because these were not just decorations. They were sacred images placed in sacred spaces. Some researchers think these deep caves were used as ritual sites where shamans or spiritual practitioners would go to enter trance states and communicate with the spirit world. The idea goes like this. In darkness, cut off from the group, perhaps fasting or using plant-based drugs. A shaman would enter a changed state of awareness. In that state, they would experience visions, geometric patterns that would slowly turn into animals, human figures, spirit beings. And then they would paint what they had seen. The art itself shows signs of this process. Many cave paintings include strange geometric symbols, dots, grids, zigzag patterns that researchers think represent the visual sensations the brain creates during altered states. These patterns show up in cave art from Europe to Africa to Asia, suggesting similar practices across huge distances and time periods. The animal figures often seem to grow out of the rock itself, using natural shapes as part of the image. A bump in the wall becomes a bison's shoulder. A crack becomes blood flowing from a wound. This suggests the artist believed the spirits of the animals were already in the stone, just waiting to be revealed. And many of the paintings are near places with unusual sound qualities, chambers that echo strangely, passages where sounds bend and change. Try singing in some of these caves, and your voice becomes something otherworldly. Did ancient shamans use these acoustic properties to make their rituals more powerful, creating soundscapes that made the spirit world feel present and real? But it was not just caves. The ancient landscape was dotted with sacred places, stone circles, some dating back over 10,000 years, arrangements of rocks that clearly took enormous effort to create but have no obvious practical use. They are not defenses against enemies. They are not houses. They are ritual spaces, places where people gather to perform ceremonies we can only imagine. Ochre shows up everywhere in the archaeological record, starting at least 100,000 years ago. This red mineral pigment, sometimes ground into powder, sometimes shaped into crayons, appears in burial sites, living areas, and what seem to be ritual settings. People were painting their bodies with it, sprinkling it on the dead, probably using it in ceremonies. Why ochre? Why red? Perhaps because it is the color of blood, of life. Using it in death rituals might have been a way of symbolically giving life back to the dead, or showing that they were still part of the living community. Or perhaps the color itself was believed to have power, to protect against spirits or to call on the presence of ancestors. We are guessing, but the fact that ochre appears so often across so much time and space tells us it meant something deep to ancient people. Dreams probably played a big role in early spiritual experiences. Every night, your ancestors would enter states of awareness where the impossible became normal. Dead relatives appeared and spoke. Animals turned into humans. You could fly, breathe underwater, travel to distant places in an instant. How would you understand these experiences without modern knowledge of the brain? Of course, you would think you were visiting another world, a spirit realm that existed alongside the physical one, reachable during sleep or trance. The dead live there. Animal spirits live there, and with the right knowledge, shamans could travel there on purpose, bringing back information and power. This dream-based spirituality probably led to ancestor worship, the belief that dead family members remain active influences in the community. They could help or harm the living depending on how they were treated. So you made offerings, told stories about them, kept their memories alive across generations. This created a kind of cultural immortality. Your physical body died, but your memory, your spirit, your influence could last forever as long as your descendants remembered you. And this might have been one of religion's most important jobs, holding the group together. Think about the challenges facing a prehistoric community. You have 20, 30, maybe 50 people trying to cooperate despite different interests, personal conflicts, limited resources. What keeps everyone working together instead of fighting or splitting apart? Shared belief. If everyone believes that ancestors are watching, judging, expecting certain behaviors, that is powerful social pressure. If everyone takes part in the same rituals, visits the same holy places, tells the same stories about the spirit world, that creates bonds that go beyond individual relationships. Religion does not just connect people to the supernatural. It connects people to each other. The evidence in the ground suggests this binding role was crucial. Places with signs of ritual activity often show less violence between people than places without it. Communities that invested in ceremonies and sacred spaces seem to have been more stable, lasting longer in the archaeological record. Belief made cooperation possible on a scale that would otherwise have been impossible. And maybe that is the real miracle here. Not that ancient people developed complicated mythologies or fancy rituals, but that they figured out how to use imagination to change reality. They invented invisible forces, spirits and ancestors and holy places. And those inventions changed how people behave, how groups organized themselves, how culture was passed down through time. The spirit world was not real in a physical sense, but it was real in its effects. Real enough to bury your dead with flowers. Real enough to crawl deep underground to paint visions on cave walls. Real enough to arrange stones into circles and perform ceremonies under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Your ancestors were making meaning in a universe that offered none. They were answering the hardest questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? With stories that might not have been literally true, but were true enough to live by. And those stories, those beliefs, those rituals, they were adaptations just as important as having opposable thumbs or big brains. Maybe more important, because in the end, what kept human communities together through ice ages and droughts and countless disasters was not just intelligence or technology. It was a shared feeling that something bigger than individual survival mattered, that the dead still watched, that the spirit world touched this one. That meaning existed beyond mere existence. Whether they were right or wrong does not matter as much as this. It worked. Now, as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let yourself drift. You have traveled through almost the entire span of human existence tonight. You'll walk with ancestors who painted lines on cave walls by firelight, who crossed open oceans in fragile boats, who told stories under stars that have since moved across the sky. You have seen that the quiet, hidden 100,000 years were not empty waiting. They were the true human story, full of love and loss, art and music, courage and care. Everything that came after, everything we call civilization, is just the last small chapter built on that much longer foundation. Your body still carries those deep years. Your hands, made for shaping and touching. Your eyes, made for noticing movement and following paths. Your heart, made for bonding with a small circle of loved ones. When you feel overwhelmed by the rush and noise of modern life, remember that underneath it all, you are still that person around the campfire, still watching the stars, still listening to stories in the dark, still part of a chain of mothers and fathers, dreamers and survivors, reaching back across 300,000 years. Let that thought carry you now, soft and slow, towards sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.